Hello, everyone. When I started these podcasts well over a year ago, it was because in both my personal and professional lives, I was aware that I was just surrounded by people with a wide variety of interests and knowledge and experiences and stories. And I just found that I was very curious about these things and just wanted to know more. I guess I would consider myself a jack of all trades and a master of none. And, I sort of self-deprecatingly say that I know a little bit about a lot of things, but not a lot about a lot of things. So I thought it would be, first of all, fun and worthwhile for me to sit down and talk to people who have knowledge and experience that I don't, and if along the way others learn something too, all the better. So we've had a chance to cover a lot of topics, and I'm always on the lookout for interesting people and stories to talk to, and reaching out to people. And we've got some podcasts planned coming up that I'm hoping come to fruition. It's sometimes a big step between the idea and the planning and the actual completion of the podcast, but we're working on some things. I'm interested in looking and drilling a little deeper into things like depression and anxiety and PTSD. Got an interesting conversation hopefully lined up that has to do with something completely different, which is the current state of things in Puerto Rico after the devastating hurricane, and some of the efforts being made there to restore power and water and that kind of thing. So hopefully that conversation can take place. But one of the things that I have been interested in for some time is what is now most commonly referred to as the opioid epidemic. It seems that I can't really go a day without finding information about this. Now that has a lot to do with our line of work and the fact that on social media, on Twitter, I follow things like the CDC or things like SAMHSA or the Department of Health and Human Services, those kinds of things, National Institute on Drug Abuse. So these stories, because I follow these things on social media, these stories are presented to me every day, and every so often there'll be a story maybe on the national news on television about some aspect of the opioid epidemic. So as we sort of think about these podcasts, I've really tried to figure out how we could best cover this very complex idea. Several months ago, we did a podcast with a legislator here in the state of Michigan, and we talked about some of the legislative efforts to address the opioid epidemic. And interestingly enough, I saw in my local newspaper just over this past weekend that one of the things that we discussed in that podcast, a database wherein prescriptions for individuals can be tracked, that law was passed here in the state of Michigan, and I think that those efforts are going to move forward. That's one of the things we discussed in that recent podcast. We also discussed things like limiting supplies of narcotics to 7-day prescription, a 7-day supply rather than a 30-day supply, and things like that. So that was an interesting conversation, but that was just one angle. I think we can. It's clear to me that we're going to take a look at this from multiple angles. It's one of the reasons that I'm talking to you today. But as I look at this opioid crisis and think about how we might want to talk about it, I just get overwhelmed with the numbers. I think I could sit here for quite a long period of time and just quote you the statistics that I've seen and that I've got here covering my desk. And I think that's one way to look at it, but I think it's hard sometimes to understand what those numbers really mean. But they can be, when we stop and look at them, they can be pretty staggering. For example, I'm just looking at a single infographic here, and it's just covered with information that really is eye-opening, including the fact that according to Health and Human Services, which I would think is a fairly reliable source, 170,000 people a year use heroin for the first time. That's a staggering number, just a staggering number. And we add that to the fact that 116 people die every day from an opioid-related overdose. That is a staggering number. And I can tell you that it has touched our family. We had a member of extended family who passed away last year from a heroin-related overdose. Again, not somebody that I was particularly close to, but close enough to where those kinds of things can hit home. But these numbers can be overwhelming, and I think while it's worthwhile to talk about them, and it's something that we can put our attention on because it helps us understand what the scope of the health crisis is. I think it would be also worthwhile in these podcasts to talk about some personal stories and talk about just exactly what it's like for people who are involved with opioids or their loved ones and so on and so forth. So we're gonna take multiple approaches to this. But having said that, I do want to talk about one more number that I was really stunned by. And if you are interested in this at all, I would have you find yourself a copy of the March 5th, 2018 special edition of Time magazine. The special edition was called the Opioid Diaries. And there are a series of photographs in this edition of Time magazine and some stories. And they just do a very good job of covering this issue from all different angles, from families to people who are actively using, to recovering people, to first responders and so on. It's just it really I think does a very good job of putting a face on this opioid epidemic. But the number in that magazine that jumped out at me, when I read it, I had to reread it, and it was the fact that in both 2015 and 2016, here in the United States, one of the richest countries in the world, here in the United States, in both 2015 and 2016, the average life expectancy went down. To me, that was shocking, and I think the magazine goes on to point out how that is in part related to this opioid epidemic. To me, that was the thing that stood out to me. And all of these numbers, 170,000 or 2.1 million or 504 billion in economic costs, all these numbers that I read over and over again, and even this idea that there's 60,000 deaths in a year. None of that really got my attention, I think, like the idea that life expectancy here in the United States has gone down in recent years. I guess if there's, to me anyway, if there's anything that illustrates just the significance and the size of the impact, it's that number. So that really stuck with me. Now another thing too, I read stories or I hear things and I think, well, this is something we should talk about in a podcast, and we should take this approach, and we should talk to these folks, or we should kind of look at it from this angle. And so it's become clear to me that this is something that we're going to cover over multiple podcasts. But I remember last fall, I was driving in my car when somebody reached out to me and told me that Tom Petty had passed away. Now, being of a certain age, been a fan and continue to be a fan of Tom Petty's music, very much so. But somebody contacted me when I was in my car last October and said that Tom Petty had passed away, and I was, of course, surprised by that and saddened by that. It was shortly thereafter, hearing that news, that I heard that the stories started to come out about how on his most recent tour he had been in pain, I think from a hip injury or something similar to that, and so when the news came out some months later that opiates had played a part in his death, it's sad to say. I guess the reality is I wasn't surprised. Same thing, you hear about the death of Prince and the fact that he had an extremely high level of fentanyl in his system, and the fact that that didn't surprise me really got my attention. I thought, well, the fact that I'm not surprised by this means that this is so widespread that we're not surprised when we hear these things. And these are just, two very, very famous, very well-known entertainers, let alone the 60,000 other people who have died in the course of a year. So it just stays with me, and I think I want to spend some time in these podcasts diving in a little bit deeper. So to that end, I want to tell you that I'm very excited to talk about one of the podcasts we have scheduled here before the end of April. I'm going to be talking with Judge Linda Davis. Judge Linda Davis is a drug court judge here in Macomb County, Michigan. She's also affiliated with a program called Hope Not Handcuffs. And she's quite a go-getter, and she is really working to put together partnerships with law enforcement and treatment to provide pathways for people who find themselves caught up in opiates and other narcotics, to find a path not through law enforcement but through treatment, through drug court, with the assistance of law enforcement. So I'm sure that when we sit down to talk, we're going to talk about Hope Not Handcuffs, and we'll talk about what exactly happens in a drug court. I happen to be a fan of drug courts. I think the concept is great. I'm gratified to see that around the country we'll see thousands of new drug courts pop up. I think it's a great approach. Now, that approach is limited. Drug courts certainly are dependent on whatever funding sources they have, and I think the caseloads, the ability or the number of persons, the number of clients that they can see is limited by this funding. So, but as the evidence mounts that these drug courts work, hopefully we'll see more and more and more of them. For our part here at ADE, just a bit of a shameless plug here. Those of you that listen to our podcast know that we provide, as part of our work, we provide substance abuse assessments. And as a result of the opiate epidemic, if you will, we created an assessment specifically for opiate and opiate users. And I'm hoping that we can play some small part in helping folks get the help that they need. I've been around a long time, and in my career, I've said this to groups of people as I do presentations over the last few years. Back in the late '80s, I was involved in a treatment program, and we had this was an inpatient program, 76-bed inpatient program, and we had folks that used alcohol, folks that used drugs and alcohol. But we were dealing with what might have been called an epidemic at that time, and that was crack cocaine. And we decided that within our treatment program, we would build a treatment track specifically for users of crack cocaine. And I don't want to go into it too far here, but there were some successes that came out of that, and I think we learned some things out of that. Just sort of some unintended consequences that came out of that. But that was sort of an experience that we had dealing with an epidemic, if you will. And I use that word sort of in air quotes, but an epidemic, if you will. And then years later, we started to see a lot of attention paid to methamphetamines over the last 5 to 7 to 10 years. Not only in the treatment programs that I was sort of affiliated with, but in popular culture and that sort of thing. I remember clearly, and I've used this example many times, in my travels, I happened to stay at a hotel, and hotels often have the USA Today newspaper available to you. And I remember one morning I picked up the USA Today paper, and on the front page of the USA Today, above the fold, so they were giving significant attention to this, there was an article about how the United States needed more funding and more treatment to address the methamphetamine epidemic, if you will. And I thought to myself at that time, well, that, more things change, the more they stay the same. We've had this conversation before about other drugs. And now we're in 2018 here, and we're having a similar conversation about opioids. And there's some differences, though. I think, we're seeing just staggering numbers of deaths. And one of the things that I'm interested in talking to Judge Davis about is what these things have in common and what makes this opioid epidemic in 2018, what makes it different. Is the number of deaths make this a much more severe crisis than ones we've dealt with in the past? Is this focus, one of the concerns I would have is this focus on opioids distracting us? Are we taking our attention off of the still current and still very significant methamphetamine problem in the United States, as well as, of course, the significance of the alcohol use in the United States? Is our attention being diverted from those things onto this current opioid crisis? Is that true? Is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? And that sort of thing. So I'm interested in her perspective on that. I'm also interested in, and this will probably be, again, we'll touch on this issue probably in a number of podcasts, but this idea of medicinal and recreational marijuana. There is a significant argument to be made that if marijuana were legalized, less people would use opioids for pain management. I think that's an idea, a conversation worth pursuing. And again, in my personal and my professional conversations, I've talked to people on both sides of that argument. Here in Michigan, as you know, I'm coming to you from the state of Michigan. It's very, very likely, from what I understand, that the idea of recreational marijuana will be on the ballot here in Michigan soon. Public opinion polls that I've seen say that it would probably pass, and we would be one of the next wave of states to have legal recreational marijuana. Again, I don't know that that's true. That seems to be my perception of it. I'm interested in what Judge Davis has to say about that, but that may be another podcast series. But that is related to this opioid conversation, because the argument that if marijuana were more readily available for pain management, less people would rely on opiates and other narcotics. That may or may not be true, but I think it's a conversation worth having. So I'm looking forward to continuing this conversation. I'm looking forward to continuing to learn more. It's going to be interesting to talk to Judge Davis. So subscribe to the podcast, if you will, or look for the podcast that we have planned, scheduled here. I'm really looking forward to it. If you're interested, you can find Judge Davis online. I've seen some YouTube videos of her speaking, and Hope Not Handcuffs is you can look them up online, and these folks do some great work. And so we want to support that in any way we can. And if ADE can play a part of that, we'd be, of course, very happy to. I thank you for your continued support of these podcasts. We plan to continue to do them. If you have a podcast idea, if you'd like to be a part of a podcast, I'd love to talk to you. This has been just a tremendous amount of fun for me to talk to people, to meet people through the podcast, and to learn. And I look forward to continuing that. So again, thanks for your support. If you have any feedback or ideas for us, please get a hold of us. Thank you very much.